Hi Andy, good to see you again. Good to be back
Yeah.
recording the next conversation in our series. This will be an interesting one because we're not talking about a specific methodology per se. We're
Mm.
looking at qualitative work, aren't we? But we're looking at maybe some of the frustrations that we both share from reading work, qualitative research around this notion of rigor and trustworthiness. So quantitative work, we might talk about validity and reliability. We don't use those terms in qualitative work. But I know you've done a lot of this
Yeah.
in your role as a reviewer. So just to start the conversation off, what are some of these frustrations that you have when you're sort of looking at the quality of qualitative work?
Yeah, it's such an interesting area, isn't it? And the frustrations I think originated so as we let's take it back to sort of 1984 when Lincoln and Gruber's work, and they had that the checklists and these matching criteria. So we were like credibility or internal validity, and we had things like dependability, confirmability. So we've got things like reliability, transferability, transferring findings. So on one level, that's fine. It sort of made sense, and that led into the sort of checklist things. And I know we're going to talk about that in a minute, like things like member check-in and methodological triangulation. So, and some of these things are really valuable. And one thing I think is always valuable is the audit trail because we want to see a picture of how people have gone through things. But I think we've got to think as researchers as well, what's the methodological approach? What's the philosophical position? And what's the analysis you're doing? And what's your aims and objectives? Let's start there. And I think when we think in terms of quality, there's different ways to think. So firstly, I'd say you've got to think in terms of a methodology. Is it narrative? Is it ethnography? Is it phenomenology? Is it grounded theory? They've all got different quality markers, in my view. And that can be just terms, techniques that are used in each. But then we've also got the checklist. So we've got the core rec. So when we think about reviewing, we could think about the core rec for like, have they got the right subtitles in the methods? Have they followed this a technique or procedure that we're expecting? Or the SRSQ, O'Brien's work. So again, that's sort of saying, well, you should do, these are your steps, these are the things you should write out. Um, and yeah. I guess on one level for me, it's like have we followed sort of the checklist and have we done a quality aspects of each of those elements? So that could be methodology, paradigm, sampling, setting, participants, um, uh, analysis, reflexivity. So have we followed all of those? And there's and is it quality from that point of view? And then I think you've also got to think, well, from your methodology, like I said, what is it important for narrative? What's important for ethnography? Now we can talk about this in a minute. What's important for IPA if you've got doing that or grounded theory? And for me, they're all different. It's all slightly different. So if we come back to that first statement around checklists and this sort of idea of matching criteria, I don't think it works. So I think does that give a good starting point?
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned something there, the correc. So
Yeah.
is that something that you think is useful, or you think that's something that's out outdated or misused?
It's really useful for an empirical work. It's really useful because it gives you a guide of what to write for your subheadings in your methods. So in terms of quality of the method section, it ticks that box to some extent. And so does O'Brien's standards for reporting qualitative research. Again, it's sort of it ticks the box. I don't think it's perfect, and the reason why I don't think they're perfect is because I think you have to look to your methodology. So in IPA, like I say, you've got these particular techniques we spoke about, the double hermeneutic, the hermeneutic triangle. In grounded theory, you might have constant comparison, different outcomes, goals, and techniques that are being used. So it's sort of a general guide which is useful, but it's missing
Mm.
what actually should be going in those different aspects and whether actually it can all qualitative research can be so uniform as I'm not sure it
Right.
can.
So they're generic models that don't factor in the bespoke nature of the different paradigms that you might, or the methodological approaches that you might be using.
Yeah.
The other one that springs to mind, and maybe this is in a slightly different category, but Tracy's Tracy's Big Eight, qualitative sort of criteria. So I know that's been critiqued in the literature as well, but probably has some useful elements to it. just like the other models you've mentioned there. So is it about using these models in a sort of open-minded way, in a careful way, using them as rather than using them literally, using them, you know, sort of to enhance one's work?
Yeah, I think they're useful because you can go back to them and think, do I need this? So I think you've got to be critical of their use.
Yeah.
So yes, state that, and journals want them, don't they? The journals like, oh, you got to adhere to this or that. But I think as a qualitative research, you need to be critical of their use. And I think as we come back to this idea of reviewing qualitative research, which I've done a lot of, and
Mm.
how that's developed through, often checklists were developed. And those checklists could be, you could use the COREC as a checklist. Have they done this? Have they done that? And one of the problems I found with that is actually a lot of the items become redundant because they're not sensitive to to a lot of things. And it depends on your review outcome as well. So if we look at the more recent qualitative checklists, again, which is quite interesting, something like the JBI checklist is quite interesting. Let me read you out the first three questions of the JBI, which probably
Okay.
highlights the points. Right, so question one, is there a congruity between the stated philosophical perspective and the research methodology? So is there that link? Again, same question, but for between methodology and the question. And then the same question for the methodology and the methods used. So they're saying, does it work? When you put, so you can't just use a checklist. You have to say,
Mm.
does it all work together? Do these different elements work together? And I think that's a good question
Yeah.
to ask. So I think that's a nice way forward. I think in terms of reviewing, the way that the other thing that started to happen there, and one thing I sort of rallied against, is that started to use checklists as a way to an indicator for how confident we are in the themes that come out. So again, it's sort of this matching. We did this
Yeah.
in systematic reviewing. We've got a quality criteria. We're going to put it to the results, and then we're going to be confident in the results. So again, it's useful on some levels, but I think that there's a danger often that we try and link back to our reference point of quantitative work, and you know the problems there. And I think we spoke slightly earlier before the meeting about this idea of generalizability uh, and the statements that come with that sometimes.
Yeah, I wonder whether it even goes even deeper than that, Andy. There appears to be a bit of a paradox here, where we're trying to understand the quality of qualitative work, which, if we look at that very simplistic way of looking at paradigms, where we have a positivism at one end, where we've got definite yes, no answers, and the interpretivist or constructivist end at the other. We're clearly not looking at that positivism end of the spectrum here, yet we're almost trying to apply positivistic criteria here, box ticking, yes,
Mm,
no, I've done this,
mm.
I haven't done this, which detracts from the interpretivist nature of what we're doing, and the nuance and the flexibility and the
Mm.
subjectivity which is inherent in this type of work, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think one of the things I teach to the students is like, well, let's think about the outcomes and what the work's doing and what you're intending. So with narrative, I think a really good story, quality of a really good story might be, does it give a great insight? Does it impact you? Does it emotively impact you? Does it make you want to change what you're doing? Not because it's got loads of numbers, because it's the way it's presented to you is sort of impacting and valuable, and therefore sample of one is lovely and great, and it will do all of that. So criteria there is way off, isn't it, compared
Yeah.
to reliability and validity? It's just, and this idea of truth, that the truth is less important than it is to get the understanding and impact of the story. So I think
Mm.
that's absolutely
That's an
essential to
interesting one, that
understand.
is, that sample of one, so qualitative work often gets bashed, doesn't it? Because, well, you've only looked at a small number of people here. How can this be useful research? And I often see in papers, that apology and the limitations, or the
Oh,
limitation of this study is that we only drew upon a small sample size, and you're
yeah.
thinking, no, that's not a limitation. I know that's something that bugs you as well. So, is it worth picking up on that?
It is worth picking up on that, and that's one of the things I say in my lectures. Please don't be someone that puts that in, because if you're putting that in, you've missed what your methodology and your research framework is. trying to
Mm,
achieve. You've so with our narrative example, we might be trying to impact, to give that insight, to give that a story, different components of the story that follow through, that others can relate to. So, people can take parts of stories, they can take parts of experience and use them. It's valuable. So you don't have to have more than one. You've got other ideas that you might want to achieve. So sometimes if I'm looking at what's common across people, that might be valuable. Or in grounded theory, it's a bit like, well, I've got this theory and I think this works, and it could work in your setting from a theory point of view of how these things connect together, these ideas, these topics, and what the outcome is. We're trying to achieve different things. We might be trying to achieve sort of an analytical generalizability because of the theory or model or process we've generated. We might be trying to achieve transferability, or some sort of relatedness, or just the fact that people can relate to it, or get the idea or the concept and think, actually, that I can understand that, I can relate to it. That's enough. It's enough to be able to relate to it. You don't have to be the same,
and,
or have
yeah,
that.
and I guess there the intention of the research is to help change the way people think about things.
Yeah.
It's not to provide some kind of proof that this is now the new way to do it. It's about changing the way people view different contexts, and what have you. And I suppose from my perspective, that's where, when we're working with qualitative research, um, we talk about methodological choices and paradigms, and that's a much more important, maybe not more important, but there's more onus on it in qualitative work, because
Mm,
the reader has to understand the process to then make a decision on how they use the findings as a
mm.
reader. Whereas in the quantitative world, it's a little bit more simplistic, isn't it? It's a little bit more straightforward because there aren't so many ways to do it. Therefore, we talk about it less.
It's unchanging. Stats are unchanging. You can have stats articles, like Bland and Altman things, statistical techniques derived from people from way back when don't change. They're always the same. They're consistent. And I think one of the problems we face on my course on physios come in with a very quantitative brain. They're taught stats. They're taught that sort of things, and therefore they bring that and their knowledge of quality there into qualitative. And that's part of a problem. And I think the other thing I think is where you can't devote a lot of time to teaching these different areas. Um, it's hard to get them to think about the philosophical worldview, the methodology, and then how that translates to what you want as an outcome. So I think we're in quite a hard space, aren't we, in some ways,
We are,
as
and
qualitative researchers?
I guess that's the joy of having these conversations. I mean, it's helping me, and I hope it helps. In a small way, people listening to these, that for me, part of this process of having trustworthy or rigorous qualitative research is our ability to explain our worldview, to explain the tradition that we've used to conduct a research, to explain the claims that we're making. Those claims are based in this context from this perspective. So our ability to sort of thread that through the research, that's a huge part of where rigor comes from in qualitative work, isn't
Mm.
it? Which is tricky because we're dealing with complex concepts here.
Yeah, we are, and I think as a researchers, we need to think about where do we go for this quality criteria. So one way is to look for criteria that matches methodology, like narrative or ethnography or whatever it is. Other ways is to look for different examples of how people look at criteria. And I remember one article by Keto in 2008. I really liked because I felt it was asking very different questions than the traditional checklist, like the core. So I'd recommend that, and that talks about clarification, justification, procedural rigor, representativeness, and interpretation. I think the other thing to think about sometimes is like the how of qualitative, the how of interview. And so as you think about those different aspects in the checklists, I think how do we create quality in each of those aspects? So that's another question probably for the listener. And when you're interviewing, I've read a nice article by Levy in 2021, and they talk about, he draws a lot on Rogerian psychology. for creating the right environment. So the how is being really important, non-judgmental, reflecting back what's being understood. So I think breaking that down a bit further in that example is really useful too in
Mm.
terms of quality.
Interesting, you use the frame there, the term there, non-judgmental. That sort of triggered something else in my mind. So this is something that I quite often come across in qualitative work, which is another throwback to the quantitative world, where people will sort of say, well, that's just your opinion, or I'll actually see qualitative work where they're trying to reduce bias, this notion of
Mm.
bias. Um, what's your take on bias in qualitative work? Because it's definitely something in the quantitative world that's almost like it's a massive,
Yeah.
sort of red cross, isn't it? We can't have any bias. It invalidates things. Whereas, to my mind, in the qualitative world, it can be seen as a benefit.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think this idea of reflexivity sort of heads that off quite well as a
Mm,
general concept, and that's in the core work again. It's a part of that. So understanding who you are, who the person is, and the answers that you get back might be dependent on your culture, how well you're known. A lot of those things of reflexivity. So that's one thing. I think I know bias comes up in grounded theory a bit, and other areas, depending on the type and approach. And again, it comes back to that philosophical worldview. In descriptive phenomenology, it comes up in the sense of you're trying to bracket. You know, this idea of bracketing off your knowledge and who you are, and focusing purely on the environment. So that's where it comes up. And I think I have less issues there where you're attempting to listen well, you're attempting to reveal and look through the eyes of someone. So to bracket off in terms of limiting your biases on the
mm,
research, I understand. I think the danger is, and what you're getting at is that actually bias is a quantitative term that's just flipped, and then we use the same concepts um and put them map them onto our qualitative research. And I think in that sense it's wrong. So I think
mm.
in the right context and within the right methodological framework, that there might be a use for the word, but I think what I see sometimes from our students is they've just flipped it and to say we've got to limit bias, and then they move on, and it's a bit like you haven't thought into or dug
Yeah.
into why you're saying that or what it means, and actually does it have any worth at all?
I guess bias is a has a negative connotation to it straight away, doesn't it? And
Yeah.
what we don't want in qualitative work is a sort of closed-minded bias. If we were to replace the word bias with subjectivity or opinion, I guess so long as we're open to other opinions and perhaps part of the analytical processes that we are engaging in reflective conversation with other
Mm.
researchers, other people involved in the project. I guess where I get frustrated is we can never entirely take away subjectivity, and therefore we could be accused of an element of bias because this is my opinion as the researcher.
Mm.
Um, and I think sometimes we see qualitative work where they try to eradicate that by saying, well, two other people coded this data and they came up with exactly the same stuff, therefore it's objective.
Yeah.
There's no bias.
Yeah.
You kind of go, well, you're almost again missing the point of what we're doing here. So we've been reflexive, and we've cross-referenced our ideas and we've come at this from different perspectives, but we're, we're still constructing our own reality here. We're still making our own interpretation as a team. Therefore, it's impossible to eradicate that subjectivity, and we're not trying to because we're the people making the call here.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I've seen that. And yeah, this idea of, well, actually, if you just do it blind, so you have two blind analysis, and it's almost like we'll just, again, we're trying to achieve something. Do I think there's got value there? I think. When I used to look at what's common and what's consistent in terms of your focus, and when you're reducing down to sort of these big topics that are experienced by a lot of people, there
Mm,
might be some value there. But I think generally, from a social constructive point of view, which I absolutely love and welcome, I think all knowledge is valuable. And we bring in our knowledge and we create meaning when we work and interact with others. So I think for that reason, 100% with what you say. But yeah, it's definitely it's a really good point to bring up and be aware of.
I guess it comes back to being really clear on the perspective you're coming from, doesn't it? And the claims that you're making. That's the key here.
Yeah, absolutely. I think if anything, and this is where you need to be a critical qualitative researcher. When we look at that JBI checklist, those few questions and saying about how do these things linked up? How's your philosophy linked up with methodology? How's methodology and methods? And how's your analysis with the aims and objectives? And being critical about does this work? I think is a job for a good qualitative researcher rather than just saying, well, here's bias, we'll slap it in. We've got to use two blinded people because that's what quantitative researchers do. So I think we need to be critical and we need to ask ourselves those questions and what works. And have we looked at quality from these different aspects of what we do as a qualitative researcher?
I mean, in some ways, it feels as if if we're trying to help people who are doing qualitative research. In some ways, I guess what we've talked about today could be helpful in demystifying some of the sort of frustrations that we see. But ultimately, there is no easy guide. There's no thing that you can go to and say, right over here, this is the trustworthiness thing. You know, it's just it's a difficult thing to do, and it's about becoming familiar with the choices you've made that are steering the process.
Yeah, 100%. And I think one thing you can do is you can get quality articles on methodology. So you can get a quality article for narrative. You can get quality article for ethnography or quality article for a particular type of grounded theory or
Yeah.
like IPA again, Smith 2011. Shermez does a lot of work in grounded theory, social constructive grounded theory. So we can locate some quality indicators or metrics which link up with methodologies quite easily.
Yeah.
There's bigger issues which we can't so easily do, I think. And that's like, well, let's plonk in a paradigm on top of that, and then suddenly you've got, like you say, a few more challenges, and you've got to be a bit more critical. So, um, I think any student listening to this needs to think, I probably need to be critical about what I do, but I probably need to take my argument to a colleague, a supervisor, and someone who's going to be critical with me and ask me the questions, maybe those questions in those first few questions in JBI about how things link together and work together and do they work together. So I
Mm.
think that's probably where I'd say that's your starting point. Yeah.
Yeah, and I guess if you can find, once you've settled on a methodological approach, if you can find a paper that is talking about quality in that approach, and then
Yeah.
maybe take those bigger, more generic models and cross-reference the two and sort of say,
Yeah.
well, this feels really relevant from
Yeah.
Tracy's Big Eight or from the correct.
Yeah.
This feels relevant. This doesn't feel so relevant,
Yeah.
and then check in that reflective conversation with supervisors. Say, have I got this right?
Yeah.
That could be a good way to go, I guess.
That'd be a great starting point, and I think that no time wasted when you do that. No
Mm.
time wasted because it's complex. It's not. It's like we said. I think you always got to remember it's not a replication criteria. You can't do that. And because of that, you have to go through that process and start perhaps there. And I think you'll be on safe ground if you do that.
Mm.
Yeah.
So, is there anything else sort of on your radar, Andy, from your reviewing work that you think is either something that is goes across lots of different methodological approaches worth
Hmm.
talking about here, or any other frustrations that you have from looking at qualitative work?
I think the biggest frustration with qualitative work and from reviewing is the lack of audit trails and the lack of understanding of how people went through their analytical procedures and got their results. When I don't see that, when I don't see, and I'm not talking about, the hundreds of pages you've got. I'm talking about like examples so someone could think these are the steps that they took from the raw data to their end result. Step one, step two, step three, step four. if you don't see that, it's really hard to work out what they've done and how they've got to where they have and what procedures have been followed and how that matches with the methodology. So I think that's something I'd always ask for as an editor.
Mm,
I think reflexivity, I think, can go through all qualitative approaches. Locating yourself, I think, has value in all qualitative approaches. Um, those two are really quite important as quality indicators, I think, and think you'll see them appear in different methodologies regardless.
yeah, interesting, the audit trail. So obviously in quantitative work, we want to have a similar thing so that the study can be repeated.
Mm.
Now, I guess I'm looking for you to tell me whether I'm on the right tracks here or not.
Sure.
Qualitative work, the audit trail, to my mind, is less about being able to repeat the study, because if you try to repeat it, it's with different people in different contexts at a different
Yeah.
time. It's impossible to repeat it.
Yeah.
It's more about rigor and trustworthiness, so that the reader can make whatever judgment they're going to make on the outcomes of the study, that they're in a better place to make those judgments and to understand how they could use the findings. That's for me the audit trail, is it? We on the same
Yeah,
page?
it's that, and I think if we think about an article that tells you how to do analysis in 6 steps or 4 steps or whatever it is,
Mm,
it's really hard to work out how to do that analysis unless you can see someone that's done it.
mm,
So yes, you're absolutely correct. It's not that you will do that analysis on that data set and get the same answer, because your focus in inductive nature qualitative research could take you another direction, and that's fine. What it's about is can we create good practice?
mm.
Can we stop qualitative articles being plunked out? Because I could create a set of themes from looking at an interview by picking out some in vivo things and then writing a bit about it. There's my analysis done in 0 steps. So I think for me it's about enhancing the
Mm.
knowledge that people can access of the how to. How do I go about this? What does it look like to do step one and step two of this approach? How have others done it? So yeah, it's absolutely really important point to highlight to the listener. Yeah.
So essentially, we want readers, people who are reading qualitative work or engaging with qualitative work, to be taken on that sort of journey of interpretation or whatever it is we're
Yeah.
doing to analyze the data. Go on the journey with the researcher, so that it has a real influence on the person that's engaging with that research, and
Yeah.
they can go and take that influence into the real world and impact change or whatever it may be. So yeah, that feels really important, and I agree that quite often we'll see qualitative work that jumps to the findings, and I guess for the researcher that feels exciting. Look, this is what I found. This is the point I
Mm.
want to make. But the reader's going, yes, but how did you come up with this point? How have you got you've told us what you've done, but how have you got to this end point? It looks really exciting, but I don't understand how you've got there. Therefore, it's not going to land as powerfully, I guess.
I think probably the last point I'd like to make from the reviewing qualitative research is that firstly the importance of reviewing qualitative research, because there's a danger in qualitative research that you call something novel because you give the what you see a certain name that's different from someone else's, but they're talking about the same thing.
Yeah.
Reviewing reveals that what's already known, and then therefore what are the gaps. So qualitative reviews do have a great deal of value in that sense, because they're revealing what's already known, and there's a lot already known, and there's a real danger, I think, in qualitative research. You do a study just because you do a study, and you've got your own language you're using, but ultimately, how much you contribute into literature,
Mm.
without having reviewed the area, how do you know that? So I'm a big fan of qualitative review, and so maybe it's just a plug for that at the end there. But I think it is something when I've done a lot of it that you think actually a lot of qualitative research will talk about similar concepts, and I think so without reviewing, there's a danger that we can't take those steps forward in the field and area that we could, because we haven't identified what's needed, what the gaps are,
Mm.
and where we can go moving forward.
Yeah, no, a really good point. I was going to make another point. It's gone from my mind. I think I was going to talk about the importance here. If we're looking at trustworthiness, it just comes back to understanding the process, understanding the process that we've gone through in that research and articulating it, and that was it. That's what I was going to say. I think sometimes I will see in a paper or certainly in students' work a really good attempt at explaining the paradigm and the perspective
Mm,
in that part of the paper, but then it's not linked to what comes
mm,
afterwards necessarily. So that being able to thread it all the way through and
yeah.
sort of acknowledge in the findings or in the discussion that the reason we're saying this is an important point, if we refer back to the methodological approach that we're
Mm,
taking and the kind of assumptions we're making, that's why this is an important point. So I think that for me, building on your idea of, we've got to review, we've got to understand where the gaps are, but then we've got to try and link our thinking all the way through the piece, haven't
yeah.
we? That's when I
Really.
really like qualitative work when it does that.
Yeah, 100%. And I think that there's a real danger that you sort of put down these terms or these paradigms or these methodologies without really thinking about what's behind them, and there's a danger there that we need to avoid because actually when you get reviewed by someone who knows about that, I think you can get unstuck. And that's often been the case with stuff as an editor that you look at and you're like, well, they've mentioned this. The first thing I'll do is I'll go and read the paper they've mentioned, and then you see actually, oh, they've missed these steps out, so it hasn't flowed through. And that's a big danger, and it's a warning, I think, to any listener of this to avoid that, to make sure you know your approach well inside out. And again, having a critical friend as part of that, I think is really important.
And mentioning that critical friend in the method as
Absolutely, yeah.
well.
Part of your quality criteria,
Yeah.
trustworthiness, is saying actually from the very start, we talked about what this approach would mean, what would it look like if it's critical realism, like a lot of your work is, has it got the layers? If it's social constructivist, how does it view knowledge? Does that work right the way through? So yeah, yeah, absolutely, really
Great
nice.
stuff. Another good chat, Andy. We could
Yeah,
probably
great
go
chat.
on and on, but this is I think, a nice bite-sized chunk of chat for people to listen to. So if we wrap this one up now, and sure we'll be back with more in the near future.
Yep, I look forward to it, Paul. Thank you.
Thanks, Andy. Great stuff.